This reading is entitled Doing Anti-Racism Toward an Egalitarian American Society and is written by Johnson, Rush, and Fagan. The reading begins with authors emphasizing that they view both structural and individual change as crucial for creating a society without racism. And before I get into why they feel that way, I want to go over some additional sociological background slides about the different components that make up racism. Because I think for this reading, it's kind of key to understand both the structural aspects of racism as well as the aspects of racism that exist at the individual level. So while this is a contested concept or a contested definition of the concept, the basic definition, or the one that I've used in the past when I've taught race classes, is the belief that one racial group is inferior to another, a belief that is further upheld by the practices of the dominant group to maintain the inferior position of the dominated group. Often it can be defined as a combination of power, prejudice, and discrimination. Because, when you're speaking about dominant versus dominated or subordinate groups, that you are basically speaking about a power relation. When you are discussing beliefs, that's related to prejudice. And when you are discussing treatment and practices, then that's discrimination. Before we go over the definitions of those individual components in a little bit more detail, let me just address why this might be contested, or why some people contest this definition. And it has to do with that. It has to do with that power aspect. Um, the term racism, or calling someone a racist, accusing someone of racism, is a good example of how a term can take on societal meaning and a life in larger society, um, far beyond its actual academic meanings and underpinnings, right? So academics who research and study racism have this very kind of concrete idea of thinking about it and discussing it. Um, and it has to do with power relations, which means that if you are not part of the majority group in society, you can't be racist, just because you yourself, you do not have a superior position within society. You're not part of a group with a superior position. So, you can individually be hateful and you can think horrible things about other people, as a person of color. And we call that being prejudiced. And you perhaps can be discriminatory in your own kind of circle, right? You can be discriminatory in terms of who you let in your home. You can be discriminatory in terms of who you let, your son or daughter date. You can be discriminatory in terms of, even how you treat people, in at your job. And we would call that being discriminatory. We would call that individual discrimination. Um, but as academics, those are just components of racism. And the academic definition of racism does involve that power relations. Well, the thing is, compared to calling someone racist, calling someone prejudiced or calling someone discriminatory just doesn't seem to have the same amount of social power. People, don't necessarily know what those terms mean. They don't have the same response to being called that or being accused of that. So I feel like particularly in a world dominated by social media, how people use the term racist, um, in common parlance, doesn't really align with how academics define and research racism. And certainly there have been some academics that have pushed back and said, hey, maybe we should reconsider how we're defining racism and make it more aligned with how how people tend to commonly use it, and come up with another term to kind of get at what we're talking about how being prejudiced, being individually prejudiced, being individually discriminatory takes on a different uh, power, takes on a different scope when you are the member of the dominant group, right? Your prejudice and your discriminatory actions just carry more weight than the prejudice and discriminatory actions of a person with a more subordinate position within society. So, there have been some academics that said, are we being overly confusing by trying to hold on to this academic definition of racism? But I'm going to stick with this definition, not just because it's the one that I use and prefer, but also because I think if you read this reading, this is clearly the definition of racism, and this is clearly kind of the author's perspective on racism, because they mention power relations and they mention dominant and subordinate groups so often in the reading. So it's quite clear that they view racism, through this lens of power relations, not just about individual prejudice or individual discrimination. So having addressed, the debate around the definition, let me now go on to concepts that are a little less contested in terms of how they're defined. So prejudice and stereotyping, which is kind of a specific, form of prejudice, it relates to the attitudinal aspect of racism. So you can see that it relates to the thinking and feeling dimension. And that's because prejudice is a judgment, attitude, or opinion formed before the facts are known. In most cases, these aren't favorable judgments, attitudes, or opinions, but these are oftentimes opinions that are founded on suspicion, intolerance, and the irrational hatred of other groups. Stereotyping is, like I said, a specific form of prejudice, and this is where you generalize a characteristic or a set of characteristics to all members of a group, right? So if you're like, all blanks are blank, then that's a good example of stereotyping. Or even if you say most blanks are blank, that's still stereotyping. We've discussed positive stereotypes in previous videos, but it's just worth noting that even though a stereotype could be, perceived as positive, i.e., like, the model minority stereotype that we associate with Asians and Asian Americans, is still a form of prejudice. You are still judging a person and evaluating a person without getting to know them as an individual on the basis of their group level characteristics. It used to be a little easier to measure prejudice and stereotypes because it used to just be more socially acceptable to be prejudiced. People would just come right out and say on surveys and in interviews that they didn't like or didn't trust or had these negative opinions of certain groups of people. Society has progressed in such a way, not that people necessarily not that people necessarily, don't have these prejudices anymore, but they certainly know that there are social consequences and ramifications of stating that you have these prejudices. And even anonymous surveys have shown to be less effective or efficient at measuring prejudice as they once were. So people who study prejudice have had to come up with kind of new ways to try to get at, how much prejudice exists. So that top graph, this was a study where basically they were looking at tweets that people sent in a certain period of time, and they basically did a content analysis of those tweets. And they looked at it on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexual orientation, to basically just see how many people out there are basically tweeting these hateful, prejudicial things about groups that they are not clearly a part of. And so that there's a whole study, but I'm sharing just a chart related to the anti-Hispanic tweets, and you can see that they were doing it by state. And what's maybe kind of surprising or maybe not surprising, is that states that have a rather large Hispanic Latinx community. Those were some of the states that had the most anti-Hispanic tweets in terms of, per 100,000 uh, uh, tweets, out of that state. Another way in which sometimes researchers try to get at prejudice is by setting up fairly elaborate surveys where you ask people to like rank their preference and rank how warmly or not warmly they feel about different groups. And you give them a lot of questions, with multiple groups, and you repeat some of the groups and you change who you compare them to. And you basically just kind of look and see, who do they put consistently at the top and who do they put consistently at the bottom. And so this is an example of some findings that came from doing that type of research. And you can see that there are people that they groups of people that they evaluate as being more or less competent. And then there are groups of people that they evaluate as having more or less warmth towards, where, the people that they feel are least competent and they feel least warmly towards are people who, the homeless, poor, welfare recipients, while the people that they indicate that they maybe have the highest view of their competence, as well as a fairly high level of warmth towards Christians, women, whites, students, people who are middle class. And so, this is just the point that because prejudice exists in the minds and the feelings and the thoughts, it can be hard to measure. Um, which brings me to discrimination. So, discrimination deals with behavior and treatment. The definition is the failure to treat people in the same way because of a bias towards some of them because of some characteristics, such as race, religion, sex. And you are treating them you're not treating them equitably on the basis of this characteristic, which is irrelevant to their suitability for, whatever it is, right? Whether it's a job, whether it's a promotion, whether it's how you treat your students in class, how you treat customers that come into your restaurant, or customers that you have to interact with in a store. If you're treating them differently from everyone else because of some group level characteristic, and there is no real good reason for you to treat them that way, in regards to the context, then we would consider that to be discrimination. Before I go over individual versus institutional discrimination, let me just emphasize that discrimination and prejudice do not necessarily occur together, but they often do, because prejudice can lead to discrimination. Although, because we do have laws and policies against overt discrimination, particularly in areas like employment or education, um, people, it is safer to be prejudiced than to be overtly discriminatory. But as the slide notes, they often do occur to get together. They reinforce each other, and for this reason, this is how they both contribute to social inequality over time. Individual discrimination basically refers to the behavior, um, the unequal treatment of a person or persons based on group membership, right? So that means you as an individual or you and a group of other individuals, basically you treat someone unfairly, inequitably, based upon, like I said, a group level characteristic, right? So you don't let them in your club, you don't hire them at your store, you don't give them the same level of service. If you work at the store, all of that would be individual discrimination, even if it occurs in a group, right? So if you're in a sorority or fraternity and as a group, all 50, 60, 100 of you are like, hey, we don't want to admit fill in the blanks, even though it is a group of you, we still consider that to be individual discrimination, because it's still kind of being made, by a group of individuals, right? It reflects individual level decision making processes. And that's because institutionalized discrimination is enshrined in law, public policy, or common practice. And it's embedded in the routine operations of social institutions like businesses, schools, hospitals, government. I go over institutionalized discrimination in a lot more detail in the video and slides for reading 60. But basically, just some examples of institutionalized discrimination would be things like legacy policies at elite private universities, the war on drugs, which had that crack cocaine sentencing disparity, redlining, which is a practice that used to be done by banks as a way to deny loans or to assign subprime loans to people, to minority loan applicants who wanted to build or to open a business in a largely minority area. Um, a rather new type or form of discrimination that has been identified more recently, first used in the 1970s, but really caught on in the 1990s and early aughts, is the term microaggression. And these are casual actions, gestures, or words that people, use to demean, dehumanize people who are, part of some minority category. All right, so now that we have gotten some definitions out of the way, let's go back to the reading. So, the reason why the authors emphasize that, they think that both structural and individual change is necessary if you want to create a society without racism is because racism, of course, is comprised of both structural as well as individual elements. And, if you own, so, there's institutionalized discrimination, but there's also individual discrimination and prejudice, which of course exist within the individual. And the reading gives some very specific examples about how policies and programs that the US government tried to implement as a way of addressing institutionalized discrimination ultimately failed or were not as successful as they could have been because they didn't adequately address the fact that a lot of people who are part of the majority group in the United States, non-Hispanic whites, have some level of prejudice against racial minorities. And it impacts their support for those programs. It impacts their support for politicians who support or implement those programs. And it ultimately leads, and if those programs require their buy-in and their participation and they don't participate, then of course it impacts the overall effectiveness of those programs. The authors say on page 606 that, in regards to the founding fathers and the political foundation of the United States, despite the professed, democratic ideals, they were never realized. And they felt like this was intentional because, from the very beginning, when they espoused those democratic ideals, they never meant for them to apply to all people in America. They espoused those ideals with a specific type of person in mind, particularly, white men who, had some amount of economic means and stability. And although, of course, the application of the Constitution was expanded to include more people over time, for the authors of this essay, this is just not enough. And so that's why, what they're calling for, what they are theorizing about in this essay is basically the construction of uh, a new democracy, a democracy that is, they kind of describe as being a anti-racist utopia. So that's what this essay is about. It's kind of walking you through their ideas for this anti-racist, new democracy, utopian society. And they begin their vision with basically a critique of the constitutional framework, like I said, which limits the full participation and equality of all citizens. And they go over some pretty specific criticisms. And they suggest that instead of using our current constitution as a starting point for their new democracy, instead that the more recent Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was put out by the UN in 1995 is kind of a better starting point. And they offer some, suggestions about what they think the new democratic government should look like and consist of. And so that's, on page 607. And they talk about, the need for new democratic institutions and, what those new institutions need to look like if they want to really address, these anti-racist goals. And they go over some of those kind of proposed changes in the remainder of the essay. So, one of the first things that they address is that there's a need for education and re education. And they make the point that this education would not just occur in the schools and would not just be aimed at children, because they said that, so much of the educational system is curricula, what adults have been taught, has been politicized and has been shaped by a very narrow and traditionalist kind of view of race and the history of race in the United States. And so, they suggest that whether we're using the media and mass communication to facilitate that re-education, that it does need to occur, and it doesn't just need to be limited to school children. But in regards to the actual formal education system, they also make some suggested changes primarily related to how schools are funded and the need to make sure that schools are truly racially integrated. Schools in America have gone through this process of being segregated, then integrated largely through busing programs. But then a lot of them have been resegregated, as a lot of local school districts and states um, have have shut down those busing programs, and people are kind of reverting largely back to their neighborhood schools. And neighborhood schools, because so many people live in relatively racially homogeneous neighborhoods, the neighborhood schools reflect that lack of diversity. The final kind of institution that comes up in this education re-education section deals with religion. And they make some interesting points about how churches can serve as a site of racial oppression, but churches also have the possibility of serving as a site where different racial groups can come together and build coalitions and be truly integrated. The final point kind of deals with how individuals can actively do anti-racism. So, first of all, they do note that for a lot of people of color, they are already probably having to do some aspects of this. And that's because people of color, being minorities, not just in terms of resources, in most cases, in most states, they're also numerical minorities, which means that they are more likely to have to learn how to effectively interact and communicate with people who do not share their same racial ethnic background. Members of the majority group, particularly if they live in areas where they are the numerical majority, are less likely to have experience in doing this. And going back to, like I said, that power-based definition of racism, it is really quite critical, as the authors note, that more white individuals engage in this anti-racist work. Um, um, just because if this anti-racist utopia society is going to exist, it is going to require that the majority group not have individual prejudices and engage in individual level discriminations. And so they talk about this, what does this mean in terms of like organizational efforts, and they kind of go over the history of anti-racist organizations, the ones that have been both spearheaded and largely organized by people of color, as well as the ones that have been largely spearheaded and organized by whites. And they give some pretty clear suggestions about where they think more work can be done. But the primary focus in this final section is on individuals, and what needs to happen on the individual level. They acknowledge that being aware of racial privilege is key, because failure to be aware of such privilege contributes to the persistence of racism. Not understanding the ways in which your life is improved by your racial identity means that it's going to be very hard for you to understand the systematic ways that a person's life can be disadvantaged by their racial identity. An important point that they make on page 610 is that respect, as opposed to tolerance, is the necessary emotional orientation. Tolerance just kind of suggests that you're putting up with someone, you're tolerating them. Respect really speaks to acknowledging a person as a equal and being truly open to understanding their experiences. And this is necessary because they say that at the individual level, a lot of this has to begin with having honest discussions as a way of facilitating the needed work, right? You can't get to those organizational efforts if it hasn't really happened at the individual and the interpersonal level. And they say it is, the work that needs to happen, because it exists at the cognitive and emotional aspect of contemporary racism. So kind of, the aspects related more to prejudice and stereotyping. They kind of go over what they feel like are the three stages that people go through when addressing these aspects, and they talk about that on page 611. The distinction between being sympathetic versus being empathetic, and then finally being having what they call transformative insight. And they go over transformative insight in a little bit more detail, and the fact that if you look at the society we live in and not the anti-racist utopia society that they are painting a picture of, for whites who exhibit this type of transformative insight, oftentimes it is because they have a close personal relationship with a person of color, right? That person is their spouse, that person is their child, maybe that person's their best friend. Because that level of insight really does involve, the word they use is love. It involves being in a loving relationship, and they even use that as a synonym, transformative insight, as well as transformative love. That being said, they do say that there are some challenges that this does present to their utopian vision, because if the situation where transformative insight is most likely to occur is in the context of these loving, honest relationships where people really love and care across the color line, even with increases in interracial marriage, even with increases in transracial adoption. They just note that for a lot of members of the majority group, they just don't have these connections. And even people who do have these connections, it doesn't necessarily, it's not a perfect correlation, right? Just because this connection seems to present the best opportunity to develop transformative insight, people still have to do the work and have the self-awareness on the individual level. So they kind of end with that, the point on page 612, um, that increasing real respectful relations across the color line is essential to the long-term battle against white racism. But they acknowledge that this does present a real challenge because a lot of people currently don't have those types of relationships. The reading concludes with the reminder that we are all one race, human, and that other distinctions are socially constructed. And this has been discussed, right? That the amount of genetic variability that exists between humans of supposed different races is minuscule, and there are more differences within racial groups than there are genetic differences between racial groups. Despite how different we might look in terms of our phenotype, our genotypes are remarkably similar. And so, these distinctions that were created, they were socially constructed, and they were done. This was done, largely related to reasons related to power, to domination, to greed. Race was used as a justification for colonization, for New World slavery, for exploitative work relationships, um, and for kind of ongoing segregation and disenfranchisement, um, of some groups of people at the hands of other groups of people. And so, they note that racism just really detracts from the joy of life, as well as presents harms related to the health, well-being, and safety, particularly for people of color, but also for the majority group as well. And they end the reading by calling on academics and social scientists in particular to lead the way towards this non-racist utopia. And they encourage them to engage in critiques of the educational system, to engage in research that helps highlight racial inequalities and helps pave the way for a non-racist future. Calls on academics to educate their students, so that they can perhaps achieve this transformative insight. And of course, this might be because they're all academics and they imagine that maybe academics have more power, than what they might really have in larger society. But that is who the authors direct their call of action to. They end their reading with a quote from the "I Have a Dream" speech by Dr. Martin Luther King. And just this idea that this non-racist utopia is not as far-fetched, and is not as impossible, as what it may seem, when we're reading this piece. So the question I encourage you to consider based on the reading. So as opposed to focusing on the practicality of this utopian vision, because I think maybe we all could pick apart this reading and point out the ways in which it's hard to imagine, um, the logistics behind, this vision occurring, the likelihood of this vision occurring. Instead, I just want to pose some questions related to its desirability. Um, do you think the vision that they put forth is desirable to most Americans? Because they are calling for and requiring the most change, um, um, the most change from the majority group. And that change would result in that group having less societal privilege and power than what they currently have, which of course just raises the question, like, why would they give that up? Like, what would motivate them to? So, do you think that this would be desirable to most Americans? If it is not, how might this vision be packaged or presented to increase support for it? And even if the vision in its entirety is not possible, is not practical, is not desirable, were there some aspects of this vision that you felt were viable and could be implemented in contemporary society?